in the glittering capital of Heian Kyoto, where poetry and ritual mask the dangers of court life, a young princess was consumed by fire. At only 25, Princess Tokiwa, once the pride of Kyoto, was reduced to ashes amid schemes of power. Her death was not merely a tragedy, but a haunting symbol of how fragile human life was against the merciless flames of politics. In the splendor of the Heian court, Princess Tokiwa was born into an era that posterity would later call the golden age of Japanese culture. The Heian period was a world where refinement was cultivated as carefully as a delicate blossom, where aesthetics were elevated above all else, and where poetry could determine reputation as much as lineage or politics. It was within this intricate web of artistry and power that Tokiwa drew her first breath, the daughter of a noble family whose bloodline connected her directly to the throne. The palace of Kyoto was more than an administrative center. It was a theater where beauty, grace, and ritual intertwined with ambition and rivalry. Within the painted screens and lacquered halls, courtiers whispered verses of waka poetry, as though each syllable could shift the tides of favor. Lanterns glowed softly upon silk robes dyed with colors so rare that only those with the emperor's sanction could wear them. It was a place where one's gestures, one's fragrance, even the folds of one's sleeves, carried meanings that could elevate or destroy. For Tokiwa, childhood was shaped by these symbols. She wandered through gardens of wisteria and cherry blossoms, where ponds mirrored the sky and cranes stalked silently by the water's edge. Her nurses taught her not only etiquette, but also the art of discerning beauty. For in Heian society, to appreciate and to create beauty was a mark of one's very humanity. The sound of the koto, a stringed instrument beloved of the aristocracy, filled her evenings, while the fragrance of incense perfumed her dreams. The girl grew in an atmosphere of ritualized elegance. Festivals honored the changing seasons, and Tokiwa would walk among rows of courtiers carrying painted fans, each adorned with symbols of transience. Falling leaves, fleeting clouds, or petals that never lingered. These images etched themselves into her imagination, leaving her with a profound awareness that beauty was always bound to impermanence. Yet, within this paradise of refinement, shadows stretched. The same gardens that nurtured her spirit were also stages of rivalry. Alliances formed behind screens, glances exchanged across banquets carried silent wars. From the moment of her birth, Tokiwa was more than a child. She was a political symbol, a future pawn in alliances that could fortify or fracture the fragile balance of power in Kyoto. Still, as a child, she was shielded from the sharpest edges of ambition. Her early years remain remembered, at least in fragments of poems and anecdotes, as radiant. She became known for her delicate calligraphy, her ability to compose verses that captured the melancholy of autumn rains or the luminous clarity of moonlit nights. Even before her womanhood fully bloomed, courtiers remarked on her luminous presence, as if she herself were a blossom that had opened too early yet carried within it an unearthly grace. Tokiwa's youth was a time when the Heian capital itself seemed to shimmer with light. And yet, the brilliance that surrounded her was also a reminder of how quickly a candle could burn away. In her life, as in her society, beauty and fragility were inseparable, and both would play their part in a fate more cruel than even the darkest poem could have foreseen. From her adolescence, Princess Tokiwa became a figure of fascination. Her beauty, often described in comparisons to blossoms and moonlight, was not the ordinary charm of a court lady, but something transcendent, almost unsettling. The Heian court revered subtlety. The hint of a face glimpsed behind a fan, the shadow of a sleeve passing in a corridor. And yet Tokiwa's presence transcended suggestion. Wherever she appeared, conversations hushed, eyes lingered, and her name traveled on the lips of poets and nobles alike. But beauty alone was never enough in Heian society. What secured her fame was her gift with words. Poetry in the Heian court was not an idle diversion. It was a weapon, a language of diplomacy, a test of intellect, and an expression of soul. Men and women alike composed waka, 31 syllables of layered meaning, and through them declared love, veiled insults, or subtle allegiances. Tokiwa's verses, preserved in scattered fragments, spoke of longing, of nature, of the fragile yet burning emotions hidden beneath ceremonial calm. Her poems revealed a sensitivity that seemed almost prophetic. She wrote of dew dissolving with the morning sun, of blossoms falling before their prime, of the loneliness that clung even to nights of celebration. Courtiers whispered that she was touched by Mono no aware, the awareness of impermanence that defined Heian aesthetics. And though her verses elevated her, they also drew attention she did not seek. For in her poems, rivals claimed, lay ambitions too sharp, emotions too raw, for a woman destined to be a silent ornament of political marriage. The emperor's courtiers copied her verses onto fine paper, decorated with silver and gold dust, and passed them between chambers like treasures. Some nobles sent replies in kind, hoping for her favor, weaving their own words around hers in a dance of metaphor. Even among seasoned poets, her ability to balance elegance with aching depth was remarked upon as rare. But with fame came envy. Other court ladies, themselves trained from childhood to compose poetry and to perfect the art of allure, began to see in Tokiwa a threat. Whispers began to circulate that her beauty was too radiant, her verses too daring. Behind painted screens, in conversations half hidden by the shuffle of silk, her name was spoken not with admiration, but with malice. For Tokiwa, the attention was a double-edged sword. She delighted in the act of creation, in the subtle music of language, in the fleeting power of a line that captured the silence of snow or the hush of twilight. Yet she also began to sense the shadows her light cast. To be admired was dangerous. To be exceptional, for a woman in the Heian court, was to risk becoming a target. Her beauty and talent were gifts, but they were also snares. Each poem she composed, each glance she drew, tightened the threads of intrigue around her. At an age when most women hoped only to secure favorable marriages and quiet lives, Tokiwa had already become more than a daughter, more than a bride-to-be. She had become a symbol, radiant yet perilous, and in the eyes of those who envied her, a flame that needed to be extinguished. The Heian court was a place of dazzling light and hidden shadows. To outsiders, it seemed like a realm of elegance, where nobles competed only through verses of poetry or the delicate layering of robes. But beneath this shimmering facade, rivalries brewed with a venom as potent as any blade. For every poem whispered in candlelight, there were whispers of ambition, alliances sealed not in ink, but in glances, and daggers poised behind fans. Princess Tokiwa, with her radiant beauty and poetic brilliance, became both a symbol of grace and a dangerous figure in this intricate game. She was admired not only for her artistry, but also for her lineage. Born into a noble family closely tied to the throne, she represented the potential for alliances that could tilt the fragile balance of power. Her presence, once seen as the pride of her kin, began to stir unease in those whose ambitions clashed with her family's influence. In the Heian palace, beauty was currency, and attention was power. The admiration Tokiwa received from courtiers and poets alike was a blessing. But it was also a weapon that her rivals could turn against her. Every verse she wrote was scrutinized, every gesture interpreted. If she lingered too long in conversation with a nobleman, it was deemed flirtation. If her poem spoke of loneliness, it was twisted into evidence of dissatisfaction with her station. The same qualities that elevated her to renown were being reshaped into accusations. Behind painted screens and sliding doors, court factions debated her future. Some saw her as a perfect bride to secure an alliance, a means to consolidate influence. Others, however, saw her as a threat. Her charm could captivate powerful men. Her talent might inspire loyalty or dangerous sympathy. And in the politics of Heian Kyoto, sympathy could be as perilous as rebellion. The court was a theater of appearances. Ladies competed through fragrance, through the colors of layered robes, through the subtle art of letter writing. But these competitions were not innocent games. They were battles waged with silken weapons, where reputations were destroyed in silence, and where envy could ignite with more ferocity than steel. Tokiwa, radiant and admired, walked this battlefield daily, often without realizing that each smile she inspired also carved a wound in the pride of others. Her family understood the precariousness of her position. They cautioned her to be cautious, to temper her brilliance with humility, to veil her emotions more carefully. Yet Tokiwa, young and still tender in her faith in beauty and poetry, believed in the power of sincerity. She thought that her verses would be recognized for their artistry, not manipulated as weapons of accusation. She thought that her beauty was a gift to be cherished, not a torch that could set aflame the envy of rivals. In the end, she could not see how her radiance drew not only admiration, but also shadows. Each step she took in the palace halls deepened her entanglement in a web spun of ambition and jealousy. The Heian court, like a painted scroll, shimmered with light, but always at the edges lurked the dark stains of envy, and Tokiwa was walking ever closer to them. At the age of 20, Princess Tokiwa's life turned from the shimmering promise of youth to the heavy weight of political necessity. In Heian, Japan, marriage was seldom a union of hearts. It was a transaction, a means to secure alliances, to consolidate power, to bind families together in webs that no sword could sever. Tokiwa, with her beauty and lineage, was not immune to this fate. Her family arranged for her marriage to an older statesman, a man whose influence in the court was formidable, but whose age and demeanor offered little comfort to a young woman whose soul thrived on poetry and dreams. To outsiders, it was a perfect match. Her beauty would adorn his household, and his power would protect her family. To Tokiwa, however, it was a chain, gilded yet suffocating, that bound her to a life of duty rather than choice. For Tokiwa's heart had already chosen another path. Among the warriors who served at the fringes of the court was a young samurai whose valor and loyalty had caught her eye. Their exchanges were brief, often limited to stolen glances or hurried words. Yet in those moments, Tokiwa felt something that no poem or ritual could contain. In him, she saw freedom from the suffocating rituals of the palace, a glimpse of sincerity that the court's silken intrigues could never provide. But Heian Kyoto was not a place where a princess could follow her heart. Love outside of arranged duty was dangerous, a spark that could ignite scandal and bring ruin upon entire families. As her wedding day approached, Tokiwa felt the walls of her world close around her. Her verses, once luminous with subtle beauty, grew heavier with sorrow. She wrote of withered blossoms, of autumn winds scattering petals, of rivers flowing endlessly away from their source. Those who read them praised their artistry, yet few recognized that within them lay the cry of a woman being led away from herself. The wedding itself was an elaborate spectacle. Lanterns glowed across the palace grounds, silk banners swayed in the evening air, and the fragrance of incense mixed with the faint sweetness of sake. Courtiers smiled, exchanged verses, and praised the union as a triumph of wisdom and order. But beneath the music of the koto and the solemn chanting of ritual, Tokiwa's heart was breaking. Her husband-to-be, though respected, was a man of years and burdens, bound to the weight of politics more than to affection. He treated her with a courtesy befitting her rank, but there was no warmth in his eyes, no poetry in his words. For him, the marriage was a transaction, a piece in a political game. For her, it was the extinguishing of a flame that had once burned brightly with hope. From the moment she entered his household, Tokiwa's life changed. No longer the radiant figure admired in the palace gardens. She was now a wife confined to rituals, bound to silence, and watched closely by rivals eager for her fall. The laughter of her youth, the tender glances she had once cherished, became memories fading like ink on paper. Her marriage was not the beginning of security, but the tightening of a noose. For Tokiwa, the arranged wedding was less a ceremony of union than the first step toward isolation, a gilded cage from which escape seemed impossible. And in that cage, the embers of envy and malice that surrounded her began to glow brighter, waiting only for the moment to consume her entirely. In the fragile world of the Heian court, words could wound more deeply than any blade. Rumors were the silent assassins of Kyoto, moving from chamber to chamber like smoke, clinging to robes and fans, impossible to dispel once released. For Princess Tokiwa, whose beauty and talent had already made her a focus of admiration, these whispers became the threads of a net designed to ensnare her. It began quietly, as it often did. A remark about her glances at certain nobles, an insinuation that her verses contained hidden ambitions, a suggestion that her silence masked dissatisfaction. In the Heian world, where even the folding of a letter or the ink chosen for a poem carried significance, nothing escaped interpretation. Tokiwa's every gesture was dissected by rivals who longed for her downfall. The most dangerous accusation was that of disloyalty. In an age when political marriages held families together like fragile cords, to imply that a woman's heart strayed was to imply treason. Tokiwa's lingering attachment to the young warrior who had once captured her gaze became fuel for whispers. Though their exchanges had been fleeting and innocent, they were reshaped in the mouths of others into stories of secret meetings, of hidden vows, of forbidden passion. The courtiers who envied her found eager listeners. A beautiful princess with poetic gifts was not merely a woman. She was a symbol, and symbols were easily reshaped into threats. Some claimed she longed not only for love, but for influence, that her verses hinted at desires to sway politics through charm. In a court obsessed with appearances, such charges needed no proof. They only needed to be repeated often enough to become truth. Tokiwa began to notice the change. The glances of fellow court ladies grew sharper, less admiring and more appraising. Invitations to gatherings arrived less frequently. The subtle exclusion of her presence was itself a sentence. Where once her verses were praised, they now were met with silence, or worse, faint smiles that carried hidden cruelty. Her husband's household, too, became a cage of suspicion. The older statesman to whom she had been bound by marriage listened to these whispers with a stoic face. But within him, seeds of doubt began to sprout. His political enemies were eager to turn his young wife's reputation into a weapon against him. If she was painted as unfaithful or ambitious, it could tarnish his standing, weaken his alliances, and isolate him in the ruthless world of Heian politics. For Tokiwa, the true pain was not in the words themselves. but in their effect. She had always believed that beauty and poetry could speak for themselves, that sincerity would be recognized through the purity of verse. Now she discovered that words could be twisted into shackles, beauty transformed into accusation. Her isolation deepened, and with it came a growing awareness that she was no longer simply admired or envied. She was hunted. The Heian court was a labyrinth where even the faintest rumor could lead to ruin. For Tokiwa, those whispers became walls closing in, stripping her of allies, surrounding her with shadows. She was no longer the blossoming flower of her youth, but a figure caught in the tightening grip of malice, waiting for the spark that would ignite her destruction. By the time Tokiwa reached the age of 25, the whispers had hardened into a conspiracy. The Heian court, with its painted screens and perfumed chambers, concealed a cruelty that could smolder for years before bursting into flame. In her case, the flame was not metaphorical. It was real fire, planned and unleashed, turning the silken elegance of the palace into a furnace of destruction. The architecture of the Heian palaces, so admired for its beauty, was also its vulnerability. Constructed of wood, paper, and lacquer, the buildings were masterpieces of refinement, but tinderboxes awaiting a spark. Paper screens glowed translucent in the lamplight, walls of cypress and cedar perfumed the air, and silk curtains shimmered with candle flames. The very materials that made the palace radiant also made it fragile, a world that could vanish in a single night. On a fateful evening, the spark came. No one could say with certainty how the fire began. Official records would later call it an accident, perhaps the result of an overturned lamp or a careless ember. But those who knew the venom of the court understood otherwise. It was no accident that the flames erupted in the wing where Tokiwa resided, spreading with a speed too precise, too deliberate, to be chance. The fire devoured everything in its path. The delicate paper screens that once carried the soft silhouettes of dancers and courtiers ignited like dry leaves. Lacquered beams cracked and fell, their beauty transformed into falling torches. Smoke thickened in the corridors, turning the painted walls into shadows of terror. Servants scattered, their cries drowned in the roar of flames. But when Tokiwa rushed to escape, she discovered the most chilling truth. The doors had been locked. The guards who should have stood watch were gone, vanished into the night as if forewarned. Corridors that should have offered escape became traps, their exits sealed. It was not only fire that killed her, but betrayal. Tokiwa was left to face the inferno alone, her silken sleeves catching sparks, her long black hair glowing like burning threads. For those outside the palace walls, the fire was a spectacle. The night sky glowed crimson, embers drifted like malignant stars, and the air reeked of smoke and charred wood. Yet within, a single figure struggled, caught in the merciless storm. Tokiwa's cries, carried by the wind, merged with the crackling of burning beams, lost in the chaos. The flames did not only consume her chamber, they consumed her very existence. What had been a young woman of beauty and poetry became, in those moments, a tragic offering to the merciless gods of power. In the Heian court, fire was both a weapon and a symbol, and in Tokiwa's death, it served as both. Her story in that moment became more than personal tragedy. The fire that burned her was not only made of wood and paper, it was made of envy, ambition, and hatred, smoldering for years until it finally erupted. Tokiwa had lived as a blossom admired and envied in equal measure, but in the end, she became the fuel for the flames of politics, her life extinguished in the very palace that had once celebrated her grace. The palace burned like a living creature, consuming wood, silk, and dreams with equal hunger. Princess Tokiwa, trapped inside the inferno, found herself in a nightmare from which there was no waking. The corridors that had once glowed with lanterns and perfumed incense now howled with smoke and fire. Flames danced along the beams overhead. Falling embers ignited the tatami mats beneath her feet, and each breath seared her lungs with heat and ash. She tried to escape. Her sleeves, heavy with embroidered silk, caught sparks as she ran, forcing her to tear at them desperately. The pathways she knew from childhood became alien, twisted by smoke that blinded her eyes and fire that devoured familiar landmarks. Every corner promised escape, but led only to walls of flame or doors barred against her. The great hallways, where she had once recited poetry under gilded lanterns, had transformed into a labyrinth of terror. The betrayal struck harder than the fire. Guards who should have been at their posts were absent. Servants who might have rushed to her aid were nowhere to be found. She cried out, her voice breaking in desperation. But no answer came except the roar of burning beams collapsing around her. In that silence, she realized the terrible truth. The fire was not an accident, and she had been left deliberately to perish within it. Her hair, once praised for its glossy black beauty, became a torch as stray sparks ignited it. The scent of burning silk filled the air, mingling with the acrid smoke of charred cedar. She tried to smother the flames with her hands, her cries echoing off the cracking walls. The agony was not just physical, but spiritual. The horror of knowing that she, a daughter of Kyoto's nobility, was being reduced to ash like any common fuel for the fire. For a fleeting moment, fragments of her life surged before her mind's eye. The sound of koto strings in her youth, the soft glow of lanterns in spring banquets, the verses she had composed about falling blossoms. She thought of the warrior whose eyes had once promised her escape from this world of silken cages. Above all, she thought of the inevitability of impermanence, the same impermanence she had once praised in poetry, but now felt in the most brutal form. Her screams grew weaker as smoke overwhelmed her. Crawling across the burning floor, she reached for a door that never opened. The inferno devoured her cries, leaving only the terrible sound of fire crackling, beams collapsing, and silence swallowing everything that had once been her life. In those final moments, her existence was transformed from beauty into tragedy, from poetry into ashes. Tokiwa had lived in a palace designed to dazzle, yet it had become her prison. The Heian court, with all its elegance and refinement, revealed its merciless cruelty in her death. In a world that worshipped blossoms and verses, she had been left to perish in a storm of flames, her body and spirit consumed by the very power that once celebrated her. By the time dawn approached, the palace wing where Princess Tokiwa had lived was nothing more than blackened ruins. The fire that had begun in the darkness of night had reduced her world to charred beams, smoldering ash, and silence. Among the wreckage, no trace of her beauty remained. The silken robes that once shimmered in candlelight had been devoured, her graceful form erased, her very body turned to dust carried away by the morning wind. Tokiwa's death was not a peaceful passing, but a violent erasure. She had not been allowed the dignity of a final prayer or the comfort of a farewell. Instead, her last moments were screams swallowed by smoke, her flesh consumed by the flames, her life extinguished with brutal indifference. The tragedy was not merely that she died young, but that she died abandoned, locked in a prison of fire that symbolized the merciless nature of the court. The courtiers who survived the blaze whispered that her cries had echoed through the night, carried by the wind beyond the palace walls. Some swore they had heard her voice rising like a lament, mingling with the crackle of burning wood. Others insisted that her death was too sudden for her to have suffered long. But those who knew the politics of Kyoto recognized the cruelty for what it was. The fire had been planned, the silence of the guards orchestrated, the escape routes sealed. She had not simply died. She had been executed by flames. As the smoke cleared, the air carried the acrid stench of destruction. The wing that once glowed with light and poetry was reduced to ruins. Amid the ashes, faint fragments of charred paper fluttered, perhaps remnants of the waka poems she had once composed. The sight of those burned verses seemed a cruel metaphor. Her words, her life, her beauty, all erased in one merciless night. Outside the palace, Kyoto awoke to the smell of smoke and the news of disaster. Yet the tragedy was shrouded in silence. Official records would later mark the event as an accidental fire, a calamity that struck without warning. But those who had seen the locked doors, the vanished guards, and the calculated spread of the flames understood that it was no accident. It was a sentence carried out in secrecy, cloaked in the guise of fate. For Tokiwa, there was no funeral procession worthy of her rank, no grand memorial to honor her. Her ashes were scattered by the wind, mingling with the dust of the city. The woman who had once embodied the grace of Heian beauty, who had captivated the court with verses of impermanence, became herself a fleeting presence, extinguished without ceremony. Her death was not only a personal tragedy, but also a symbol of the brutality of politics. In the Heian court, beauty could be celebrated in one moment and destroyed in the next. Poetry could immortalize the fleeting bloom of a flower, but could not save the poet herself from the fire. The embers that smoldered in the ruins were more than remnants of a burned palace. They were the final, bitter testimony of a life consumed by envy and ambition. Princess Tokiwa, at 25, became both victim and symbol. Her death in flames was not simply the end of a life, but the silencing of a voice, the erasure of a presence, and the transformation of a woman into a cautionary tale of fragility amid power. When the ashes cooled and the palace wing lay in ruins, the court of Heian Kyoto moved swiftly to cloak the tragedy in silence. Official scribes recorded the fire as an accident, a misfortune caused by the fragility of wood and paper, ignoring the whispers of conspiracy that lingered like smoke. In the carefully curated annals of the empire, Princess Tokiwa's name was reduced to a passing mention, her death treated as a footnote rather than the calamity it truly was. This silence was deliberate. To acknowledge the possibility of foul play would be to invite scandal, to expose rivalries within the court, to destabilize the delicate balance of power. It was easier, safer, and more convenient for those in authority to let her memory fade. Ministers bowed in meetings, exchanged poems at banquets, and continued their games of influence as though no princess had perished in flames. For Tokiwa's family, the silence was more suffocating than grief itself. They mourned privately, unable to demand justice without risking their own standing. In the Heian court, to cry out against injustice was to invite ruin. To question the official narrative was to challenge power itself, and such defiance was punished swiftly. Thus, they bowed their heads, composed their own verses of mourning, and allowed the ashes of their daughter to be swept away by time. Her poems, once copied with reverence onto decorated paper, were quietly set aside. Some were even destroyed, lest they be used as evidence of imagined ambition. The courtiers who once recited her lines now recited others, as though her words had never existed. In a society that worshipped memory through verse, this deliberate erasure was more cruel than death itself. The silence spread beyond the palace. Common people who had glimpsed the glow of the fire spoke of it in hushed tones, weaving fragments of rumor into stories. Some claimed they heard her voice calling in the night. Others whispered that her spirit lingered near the ruins, wandering through smoke. Yet these stories, too, were left unrecorded, preserved only in the fragile realm of oral memory, destined to fade. In this silence, Princess Tokiwa was not merely dead. She was erased. The Heian court, with its obsession for appearances and harmony, could not tolerate the disruption her death represented. Better to deny her existence than to confront the cruelty that had consumed her. Better to bury her memory than to admit that beauty, talent, and innocence could be destroyed by envy and ambition. Thus, history moved on. The palace was rebuilt, new poems were written, new blossoms celebrated. Lanterns glowed again over banquets, the sound of koto returned to echo through corridors, and the court resumed its endless pursuit of elegance. Yet somewhere beneath the lacquered beams and painted screens lingered the ghost of a young woman whose name was no longer spoken, whose verses were no longer read, whose life had been reduced to ash and silence. Princess Tokiwa's death was more than a personal tragedy. It was a reflection of the merciless nature of power. The fire that consumed her body also consumed her memory, leaving behind only whispers and shadows. In her fate, the fragility of beauty in the Heian court was laid bare. Women who bloomed like blossoms could just as easily be plucked, crushed, or burned by forces beyond their control. Her story remains a haunting reminder that behind the elegance of Kyoto's golden age lay cruelty, and behind the poetry of impermanence lay real lives extinguished too soon. Tokiwa, once radiant with promise, became a symbol of how easily a human soul could be sacrificed to preserve appearances, silence scandal, and protect power. Her ashes may have been scattered to the wind, but her tragedy endures as a bitter testament. In the shimmering world of Heian, the flames of envy burned brighter than the lanterns of beauty, and they left behind only silence.